Thank you for that very warm introduction, Joe. I did ask him to keep the bar low because with no expectations for the audience, there's no disappointment. I'd like to thank Aunty Georgina, my titta, for that welcome to country, and I acknowledge the 5 clan groups of the Kulin Nation here and the traditional owners and current custodians of country. And I'm grateful to see so many mob in the audience today, and I'd like to acknowledge all the VIPs, and by that I mean all the very Indigenous people in the room. Because we're all black enough for ourselves, and that's all that matters. Now, seriously, I think we're all VIPs in my world. So I know there's lots of commissioners in the room, but I think we all are important and do epic good in our everyday lives. I wanted to say, too, I would like to meet an Irish man called Patrick. Just putting it out there on Periscope. There will be no children. Just to be clear about that. You don't look like this at 48 when you've got kids. Right. All the money goes on eye cream. All right. I have to tell you, I'm very nervous about today because I much prefer to give presentations about chick lit where I can be funny, but there's nothing funny about homelessness in Australia or internationally. So I'm very nervous about presenting something that is a significant issue that we all need to be thinking about. I am a Wiradjuri woman. I'm from central New South Wales. I'm a Williams from Cowra, Brungle, Mission, Griffith and Tumut. I was born and bred in Gadigal country. Most of you all know that as the city of Sydney. But I spent most of my life, until 2 weeks ago when I moved to Yuggera country, I spent most of my life living on the land of the Dharawal out near La Perouse. My heart and my urban homeland is strategically placed between Long Bay Jail, Malabar Sewerage Works and Orica Industrial Estate. It is the perfect setting for creative inspiration, and I've written some books there. And because I am a writer, I wrote a paper because I realise it's the only way I will stick to time, because I come from a long line of storytellers. My words to you today come partly from my own personal story, from seeing real changes for the better in Barcelona to seeing real changes for the worse in Australia in terms of Indigenous Australians and our human rights around our homelands. I speak to you knowing that I come from a position of privilege, whether I'm waking up in Sydney or in Brisbane, or this morning I woke up in the Sofitel. I've always had a home. And I have to say, last night I posted a photo on Facebook of the view from my room, and then I deleted it because I thought how hypocritical it was for me to be staying in a place like this when I'm talking today about people who don't know where they're going to sleep tonight. My mum was born on Arambi in Cowra and lived in one of the 21 huts on the Aboriginal station there. In a general Australian context, I hazard a guess that most of us in this room are in positions of privilege when we compare ourselves to the number of Australians who could be defined as homeless today. And while I'm far from being an expert, I had to do a lot of reading and research for today's paper. I'm not an expert on the issue of homelessness. I am passionate about raising awareness on certain issues when I have been given a platform like this Human Rights Oration, and I thank the Commissioner, Kate, for the opportunity to be here today. Now, in June this year, I was in Barcelona during the lead up to what would become one of the most significant moments in the political history of that city. A new party called Barcelona en Comú, where common a reference to the Old English Commons movement together, was built on a citizens' platform created through a true grassroots movement in the city's local streets and their squares and on social media. And although the anti-austerity party was less than a year old, it would go on to win the municipal elections. The leader of the party, Ada Colau, was a young woman with a background as an anti-evictions and homelessness activist and former leader of the Platform for Mortgage Victims, always having the rights of poor families as her motivation in politics. Barcelona en Comú, at its foundation, has the local people's support. The party actually crowdsourced a code of ethics, because a citizen platform doesn't just aim to change policies, it also aims to change the rules of the game and create new ways of doing politics. A key way of achieving this is to draw up, debate and approve a code of ethics in a very public and transparent way. The Code of Ethics is a document that defines the practices that those occupying elected and appointed positions in public office should carry out in order to ensure a reasonable administration that remains in touch with real life. It sets limits on salaries and expenses that guarantee that anyone can get involved in politics, but at the same time end the privileges that have led political representatives to be out of touch with ordinary citizens. Now, the Code of Ethics sets out a 30-point action plan, including an end to housing evictions, an increase to the supply of public housing, and the fining of banks with unoccupied dwellings on its books. Barcelona en Comú has given Catalans and people all over Spain hope for real change, for a bright future with a rise in equality between the classes and a decline in homelessness. Known as Spain's anti-eviction crusader, or Barcelona's protest mayor, Ada Colau rides the metro to work, staying true to her grassroots background, and immediately began stepping in to deal with the debilitating housing evictions causing homelessness in the city she's now responsible for. And the reason I wanted to flag this is because when I was in Spain, I was there for 6 weeks in the lead up to the election, and I was hard-pressed to think of one Australian politician that had ever made homelessness part of their platform. None that I know of have ever gone to an election as part of their policy promises, and I could be wrong, but I've got the mic, so I'll just keep going. You can all disagree with each other outside afterwards. I decided on this topic in June when I first heard about it because I was so inspired by what was happening by a woman younger than me in a party that was a year old, and I went to numerous rallies and I met her, and the Catalans rally in a very dignified, well-dressed fashion, I might add. And just seeing the change in morale in that city was extraordinary. I struggle with technology. Now, we lived without PowerPoint for tens of thousands of years. Rock art was the original PowerPoint. That's not my quote, I wished it was, it's Janine Dunleavy's, but it's true. So without doubt, usually it fails. Right, now Ada Colau also made a priority of counting how many homeless people there were in her city. Basically, day one of being in office, she went and made a point of counting the homeless in her city. In 2013, 410,000 people were sleeping rough in the EU on any night. In Spain, there were at least 1.5 million homeless people, while obviously that... stat looks wrong. While in Catalonia, at least 37,000 have serious housing problems and more than 11,500 are homeless, 3,000 of them in Barcelona. It's been reported that authorities seized 95 homes a day in 2014 from inhabitants who defaulted on their mortgage payments, according to official data. On top of that, there were countless other families evicted for defaulting on rent or for occupying vacant properties. In campaigning, Colau proposed to turn empty homes into social housing, set a minimum monthly wage of €600 and make utility companies lower the price of gas, water and electricity. Colau walks the walk and does not live the standard privileged life of the politician, while many of her constituents are suffering. Rather, one of the first moves was to try to lower the mayoral salary to €2,200 a month, and those of other councillors as well, in keeping with the ethical code. But the motion was defeated by the opposition, but the Barcelona en Comú councillors announced that they would donate the difference to social entities in the city. The outgoing mayor, Xavier Trias, of the Conservative Catalan Nationalist Party, was earning €143,000 a year, which is equivalent to about €12,000. So Ada Colau was going in and taking a sixth of that, cut it down to a sixth. I've been to Barcelona many times in the past decade because I'm a method writer, and if my character has to go to Spain, then I have to go to Spain and research. So I've been to Barcelona many times in the past decade, and before Ada Colau and her movement to make change swept across the city and the nation, I had seen increasingly seen dissatisfaction at the local level for Spanish politicians. It was a depressing place to be if you talk to those affected by the decline in employment and social policy. The city as it is today is one of hope and growth, one that is in stark contrast to when I was in Barcelona as a backpacker in 1992 and watched local authorities physically move the homeless out of train stations as the city prepared for the Olympic Games planned for later in the year. And this is not something that's foreign to Australia. An article titled "With Olympics Came New Laws to Sweep Up Homeless" in the Canadian paper The Taille, the article looks at various cities around the world and their legislation around homeless people and Olympic Games. Author Kate Hislop writes about the Homebush Bay Operations Act and regulation, which was passed in 1999 to cover Homebush Bay, the site of the Olympic Village and Park. She says that police and other officials were given the power to remove people from the area for vague reasons such as causing annoyance or inconvenience, or using indecent language. I would have been moved on very quickly. The Sydney Harbour Foreshore Authority Act passed in 1999 protected Sydney Harbour and allowed police and other officials to remove people for skateboarding, rollerblading, panhandling or attempting to sleep in the area overnight. Both laws required warnings to be issued prior to arrest. According to Helen Lenski, author of Olympic Industry Resistance, Challenging Olympic Power and Propaganda, some laws had a lasting effect on the homeless population even after the Games wrapped up. Quote, Sydney Harbour Bridge area has been successfully privatised and there used to be about 70 homeless people living and sleeping in a park fairly close to the harbour near the Opera House, she says. Sydney Harbour Foreshore's legislation is the pertinent one that's empowering private security and police to get rid of what they see as undesirable people in their tourist area, particularly for New Year's, because that's when the big fireworks display is happening on the Harbour Bridge. Now, apropos of that, I've just moved to Brisbane, and I've learned only in recent days that the same kind of sweeping up of homeless people that occurred in Sydney and around other cities prior to Olympic Games, or during Olympic Games even, also happens in September each year in Brisbane when they have something called River Fire. There's a big air show and fireworks and so forth, because at the age of 40, none of us have seen fireworks before. But anyway, what they do is, what I learned is that the homeless people are moved on from South Bank as well. So in Brisbane, there are homeless people who live daily under something called the Kurilpa Bridge, near where I have a writing space at the State Library of Queensland. Now, the pedestrian bicycle bridge connects the Gallery of Modern Art, Goma, to Tang Street on the other side of the river. Now, imagine if some of the $63 million that was spent to build this bridge went towards housing those living under it. It is from here, on this, I'm pointing here, you can see it's on this side of the river, where the people known as the Kurilpa Rats are moved on the night of the fireworks. According to Common Ground in Queensland, whose vision is ending homelessness in the communities in which we operate, there are 20,000 homeless people in Queensland today. Every city has its own story of shame, where our sense of humanness can be questioned as the human rights of others are ignored or forgotten. Under the ABS definition, a person is homeless if they do not have suitable accommodation alternatives, and their current living arrangement may be a dwelling that is inadequate or has no tenure, or if their initial tenure is short and not extendable, or if the living arrangement does not allow them to have control of or access to a space for social relations. Now, in terms of statistics, I don't want to bombard people, but there are quite a few that I was astounded by and I wanted to put up. And I know that's quite small, but it's straight from the ABS page. There are a couple that were most alarming to me, and that's where we've seen increases in homelessness. So there were 105,237 people enumerated in the census of 2011 who were classified as being homeless on census night. That was up from 89,000 in 2006. The homelessness rate rose by 20%, or more in New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania and the ACT, with the largest fall being in the Northern Territory, which was down by 8%. The number of people spending census night in supported accommodation for the homeless in 2011 was 21,258, up from 17,329 in 2006. There were 17,721 homeless people in boarding houses on census night in 2011, up from 15,460 in 2006. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples made up 2.5% of the Australian population in the census of 2011. However, we accounted for 25% of all persons who were homeless on census night. Of those who were classified as homeless, 75% were living in severely crowded dwellings. It was the same proportion in 2006. 12% were in supported accommodation for the homeless and 6% were in improvised dwellings, tents or sleeping out. For non-Indigenous homeless persons, 30% were living in severely crowded dwellings, 20% in supported accommodation and 7% were in impoverished dwellings. Now, the estimate of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who are homeless on census night is likely to be an underestimate, particularly for those staying temporarily with other households, reflecting both a relatively large under-remuneration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons in the census, and because for some blackfellas, a usual address may be reported that is associated with a place rather than with a home or a dwelling. I'd like to talk a little bit now about how the Australian government is contributing to the increase in Aboriginal homelessness, particularly in the state of Western Australia. And of course, I'm talking about the forced removal, or the forced closures of remote Aboriginal communities where people are being forced to live on the fringes of other cities, towns. Now, the theme for NAIDOC Week this year was standing on sacred ground, learn, respect and celebrate. And I had a number of speaking engagements in different states that challenged me to speak around this theme, because many of us want to celebrate in NAIDOC Week all the good things that are happening in our communities. Today, to say, this is what's good, this is what we're doing that is fabulous. And I personally wanted to focus on the literature that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are producing around what it means, what connection to country and what place means to us as First Nations writers. But I felt compelled to talk about where respect was and is not being shown in terms of Aboriginal people and traditional lands today. Now, the terms dispossession and displacement, they used to be words of the past, but policies are still being written in the 21st century that include the forced removal of Aboriginal people from their land. And specifically, I'm talking about the forced closure of remote communities in WA, and I'm assuming that most people in this room are familiar with, or at least heard of, the SOS Black Australia movement, and this new need to fight an old fight for the rights to remain on country. Now, I want to give you a very short timeline of events of SOS Black Australia, which as a movement officially began in the late evening or early AM of Thursday the 12th and Friday the 13th of March, with the convergence of a group of 22 individuals on social media. And the information I'm giving you today has been given to me by SOS Black Australia. Now, it was initiated by Aboriginal people from the Kimberley region in WA, and it was the aligning of actions and frustrations in the community that had begun in 2014, triggered by the statement from Western Australian State Premier Colin Barnett, who on the 12th of November announced that he would close up to 150 remote Aboriginal communities, saying that the state could no longer afford to pay for essential services like power and electricity. On the 11th of March of this year, the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott told ABC Radio, "What we can't do is endlessly subsidise lifestyle choices if those lifestyle choices are not conducive to the kind of full participation in Australian society that everyone should have." This statement was the pressure point for the communities to take a stand, which began in the Kimberley and has since grown to become a national and international movement. SOS Black Australia became an umbrella hashtag social media presence and community response to bring efforts and community together. The first national call of action was March 19, where over 30 known local community actions occurred in every state and territory across Australia, while a combined 25,000 plus marched. International actions were held in Manitoba and London. A virtual protest was mounted, and this gained global momentum with key celebrities such as Hugh Jackman, Angela Davis and Michael Franti amongst the thousands of people representing a diverse range of communities throughout Australia and the world. And it's interesting, I was talking to someone in Brisbane last week when I said I was going to the rally there about the closure of remote communities. And he said to me that he learned about that by seeing 3 of his heroes holding a placard. So sometimes there's criticisms about what difference does that make, someone holding up a sign. Well, it makes a difference if the only way you're going to learn about something is when you see your footy legend making a statement. So it does matter. Sports people added their voice to the movement, and a petition was tabled to Federal Parliament on the 20th of March by the Greens Party. Between the 19th of March and the 14th of April, there were 17 known local actions that occurred across Australia and globally in support of SOS Black Australia to stop the forced closure of Aboriginal communities. The Australian Council of Trade Unions released a statement in support of Aboriginal communities on March 26. On the 2nd of April, the co-leader of the Māori Party in Aotearoa, Marama Fox, attempted to put a motion before New Zealand Parliament condemning forced closure of Aboriginal communities in Australia. On the 10th of April, an estimated 13,000 people and 3,500 people marched in Melbourne and Sydney consecutively, bringing both cities to a standstill. On the 11th of April, our favourite newspaper, the Herald Sun. I don't care if they've got good sports pages. If you're buying that newspaper, we can't be friends. Honestly, I can't tell you how many people say I buy it with the sports pages. Now, Martin Flanagan is the best sports writer in this country, and he writes for The Age. So, now I would have thought, so this is the headline, you would have seen it, or you would have heard about it because you don't actually buy the paper. Now, I would have thought 10,000 human rights activists might have drawn a different headline, but this obviously is the way in which Murdoch media portrays anything to do with Indigenous rights. Questionable at best and disgraceful at worst. Now, locals complaining on the day about being inconvenienced on their way home from work demonstrated their lack of humanness, and might I add, a complete selfishness when you consider what inconvenience means to people who are being forced out of their communities. The 20th of April, an open letter was tabled by the Māori Party to Prime Minister Tony Abbott on his visit to Aotearoa. On the 22nd of April, the Kimberley Land Council condemned the forced closures at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York. On the 1st of May, every state and territory participated in a rally. There were 98 actions that happened worldwide. And I want to showcase these things because quite often people just think it's black fellas and it's just us whinging all the time. There's not enough of us to do all this. It's not our issue. This isn't our issue. We don't write the policies. Over 60,000 people marched. Julian Lennon got on board and supported the Action of Political Prisoners. Jean Leman got on board in the USA and sent support. The combined reach at that stage was 12 million people. That's in Bendigo, Wilcannia, Wollongong, Los Angeles. Rolling actions occurred again in June and included American author, activist and academic Dr. Cornel West, who met with delegations all across Australia in support of SOS Black Australia. The biggest international action garnered 3,200 people standing in support of SOS Black Australia in Chicago. Melbourne's CBD was shut down twice in one day. Oh, I mean, that's brilliant, Melbourne. Like, really impressive, honestly. Melbourne's shut down twice in one day. Brisbane was shut down on the Friday and Monday. Sydney CBD was shut down on the Saturday. A camp out was held at the front of the Australian High Commission in London after their action. This is Berlin. The Berlin action held a petition signing, and SOS Black Australia was hosted by the Māori Party in Aotearoa and featured on Q&A in New Zealand. The fifth global action occurred on Friday, November 27, and in a statement released by SOS Black Australia on November 28, the following was included. It's been revealed recently that if First people in this wealthy country were ranked separately under the United Nations Human Development Index on health, economic well-being and life expectancy, we would come 100th out of nearly 200 nations. In this dire third world situation, we simply cannot afford to accept our people being forced to the fringes of larger towns where they face the threat of dislocation, violence, poverty, homelessness, imprisonment and death by drugs and alcohol. These are precisely the kind of things the Homelands movement was created to save our people from. And if the government claims to have any genuine concern for our well-being, their actions over many years prove otherwise. Now, the issue of homelessness caused by the closing of remote communities has clearly not been thought out by the government, whom I suspect are more focused on what they will be using the land for where these communities sit. It is not rocket science to figure that some of these communities sit on rich mining land. And the displacement, yet again for Aboriginal people, comes at a cost of culture, connection to country, family, spirit and health, to be replaced by cash flow to the government and individuals. I want to make the point today that these local and global actions are not occurring because we have nothing better to do with our lives. These actions occur because we do not have control over our lives. The basic human rights that other Australians enjoy in the peace of mind that they will not have their water and electricity cut off as a direct means of forcing people from their homes, from their homelands. And when I talk about we, I include myself because I'm a member of the National Aboriginal community, and what affects one affects all of us. I just want to show you a very short but powerful clip now, which has been also supplied by SOS Black Australia. I'd just like to acknowledge our signers too, who are doing amazing work. Thank you. That's a very powerful clip. Now, I just want to round up this part of my talk with a quote by Sam Cook, who's a Nicanara Nation, from the Nicanara Nation in the Kimberley region, and it comes from a journal in the US, and she provided me with this. She said, "At the back end, the plan goes far beyond calls to action. What has been sitting at the heart of SOS Black Australia is a humanitarian effort we are aiming to drive alongside the communities. It is our plan to get rid of the rhetoric around viability by replacing the flailing infrastructure and making all our communities sustainable through alternative power, water, waste solutions, as well as repair years of neglected infrastructure. This is in line with our sovereignty, and we have individuals in the community already looking to the potential to take out a class action on behalf of our Aboriginal nations against the state and federal government." As Julie Walk says, homelessness is not just about having a house or not having a house. It's about our capacity to enjoy all our rights or our lack of capacity to enjoy our rights when one is not being met. With that in mind, I wanted to touch now on the NT intervention and how its introduction in 2007 was one of the most shameful episodes in the history of Australia's racist treatment of Aboriginal people. As you all know, under the intervention, the military was sent into Aboriginal communities. The Racial Discrimination Act was suspended in order to pass the relevant legislation, and compulsory income management was introduced for Aboriginal people. Most of these measures were extended for 10 years by the federal Labor government's Stronger Futures legislation passed in 2012. I was in the Northern Territory at a writers' event in June 2007 when the Howard government, with the support of Labor and the Democrats, rolled out the NT intervention. 2 months later, I chaired a public forum organised by Women for WIC at Australia Hall in Sydney. It was there I heard firsthand from Northern Territory Aboriginal women about what was happening in their affected communities. Olga Havnan, Eileen Cummings, Raylene Roses and Rachel Williker shared stories to a packed hall of concerned Australians wanting to know how they could all help get the power back into the hands of those who had lost control over their own lives. It was one of the most emotional gatherings outside of funerals that I've ever attended. Here we go. I remembered those women as I penned my first blog, rallying the troops to get out of the NT. It was February 12, 2008, the evening before the national apology to the stolen generations. But the much-awaited sorry would follow a day where thousands of Australians converged on the capital to demand the human rights of Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory be reinstated. The rally saw people travel across the country specifically to declare their disgust at the racist legislation. I met a young Noongar woman, Natasha Moore, who had travelled from Perth just for the day. We met as the crowds gathered at the site of the Tent Embassy on the lawns of Old Parliament House. We stood there after Ngambria Elder Matilda House had welcomed politicians to the 42nd sitting of Parliament, which was a groundbreaking moment in Australian political history. After we were given a welcome by the Tent Embassy mob at the ceremonial fire, we marched, led by our brothers and sisters from the Northern Territory. I marched alongside friends I went to university with 20 years previous, supporters of Residents of Reconciliation in Western Sydney I'd met 10 years previously. I marched with family members I was meeting for the first time. I marched with local school students who were there in full school uniform. And there were many people who were united under the banner of Stop the Intervention, Human Rights Now. There were many familiar faces on the day, some locally from Sydney and others from across the country. The band Street Warriors and poets Kerry Reid Gilbert and Elizabeth Hodgson were there. It didn't matter what nation you came from. We were one mob and we were united in fighting for the rights of our brothers and sisters in the Northern Territory. I noticed that even though I'd rallied in 4 different states in recent years on issues such as land rights, black deaths in custody, budget cuts to Aboriginal affairs, the stolen generations and the intervention, this was the first rally I'd ever been to where I did not see one cop. We thought it was fascinating. There was not one police officer along our path from Old Parliament House up to New Parliament House. That's because they lined the entire Parliament House when we got there. So the wide range, but there was a lot of media there. What impressed me about this day in terms of media, because we often don't get a good run in mainstream media, but there were a wide range of media present, spoke volumes to me about how the convergence on Canberra was being regarded generally. Apart from the expected Indigenous print, TV and radio media, there was mainstream media from every medium there also. I was heartened by the media presence and them interviewing key members from the Northern Territory communities, because it meant that our issues, the issues of Australia, would get some mainstream coverage. It would further put the Rudd government on notice for what we expected from his term in office, aside from the apology. I spent much of my day with Auntie Eileen Cummings in this picture here, from the NT, whom I'd met at the meeting for Women in WIC in Sydney the year previous. Aunt was part of the Women for WIC monitoring project to keep a check on what was happening in the NT in lieu of any formal accountability process put in place by the government. And when I listened and watched her interviewed by Gunji Damara filmmaker Richard Franklin, she made it perfectly clear what needed to be done in the NT. Firstly, the government needed to start talking to communities. The Community Development Employment Program, known as the CDEP, needed to be restored so that people could work, and the quarantining of wages needed to end. She said, "Our people need to get back the power to control what's happening in our communities. We're now reliving what happened to us as children when the Native Police came in. Right now in the Territory, I'm reminded of growing up on a mission settlement." Most of us saw the apology as an important, symbolic and healing gesture for those who directly suffered under legislation that stole our parents, our grandparents, our uncles, our aunts, our cousins, our friends. Many of us also hoped it would come with practical actions to ensure that the future sovereignty for our people as well. Unfortunately, we've been disappointed on that front. On August 26 in 2011, I was part of the 45th anniversary of the Wave Hill Walk-Off. It was there that I felt the strength and dignity of those who walked off Wave Hill Station, then officially owned by British Lord Vestey. The protest was a demand for rights to their traditional country and to be treated equally with other Australians employed on the land. Like most others, I went to Wave Hill to pay respect and to show gratitude to those who paved the way for the land rights movement nationally, and to acknowledge the great strength those involved demonstrated in the face of absolute racism and adversity. On Friday, August 26, to mark what is now known as Freedom Day, I marched along with local community members, friends and writerly peers, and those who had travelled the country over to be part of the celebration. We were there also to pay homage to the memory of Gurindji Malyan leader Vincent Lingiati, and to remember the significant and symbolic gesture of the then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam pouring red earth through the local leader's hands back in 1975. It was a moment that marked the return of the ancestral lands to the Gurindji mob, and yet it was a moment declared null and void with the introduction of the 2007 NT intervention, which shifted the power of Aboriginal lives and land away from individuals and communities back to the government. The celebration, therefore, was heavily tainted with the reality of life for the local Gurindji mob today and their new fight for old rights and their desperation to reclaim the freedoms they fought for back in the 60s. With the event coordinated by Gurindji woman Brenda L. Croft, also an artist, curator and academic, and emceed by Vincent Ngati's grandson, Maury Japata Ryan, we heard from staunch non-Indigenous unionists who played a key role in activating union members nationally to fundraise to support the Wave Hill mob. Aboriginal rights campaigner and one of the first to step up to assist the Gurindji cause, Brian Manning, spoke with passion about his role supporting Vincent Ngati and stated in his address that the walk-off succeeded in 1966 because of the unity of the people to stay solidly together in the face of all sorts of inducements. To decide on a course of action and remain united to achieve what you decided. That is the job ahead. You can do it. Another speaker, Jack Phillips of the Waterside Workers Union, who was involved in the Aboriginal Rights Campaign in 1966, urged politicians present on the day, including the NT Chief Minister Paul Henderson, to go back to their parties and make them pull their socks up. A message delivered by the Central Land Council via Nyali Kunoth monks demanded a formal government apology for the shame, hurt and trauma that the intervention caused Indigenous Territorians, stating, "Throw the word intervention away. We demand an apology from our governments for the terrible recent policies that encourage assimilation and normalisation. This amounts to cultural genocide." On June 29 of 2012, I was a guest speaker at Sydney Girls High School, where they were celebrating NAIDOC Week. As the assembly occurred only hours after the Australian Parliament passed legislation to roll out another 10 years of the NT intervention, which became known as Stronger Futures, I was preoccupied with what felt like someone standing on my heart. My head was pounding, trying to understand how the media had let this significant political moment pass Australians by. I don't know if anybody was following it on that evening, but there was hardly any senators in there. It was just disgusting. So following the Senate spending most of the previous day debating legislation aimed at reintroducing the offshore processing of asylum seekers and media covering it extensively, and I'm not saying it shouldn't have been covered, but basically then, all the media went home. The upper house continued sitting until early that morning to pass the Stronger Futures legislation before a parliamentary recess. It was a non-debate, with most senators missing from the House. Now, as I sat on stage, I really appreciated hearing the words of two Year 11 legal students whose names are Ruby Lou and Isabella Olsen, and they delivered an address that demonstrated to me a better understanding of Aboriginal self-determination and native title than Australian politicians and the major parties had. On the intervention, they had this to say: "Self-determination has been the goal of Indigenous groups since even before Mabo, with the aim of it to have decisions regarding Aboriginal communities made by Aboriginal people rather than distant authorities. The Mabo decision and native title have been crucial elements in furthering self-determination and increasing the sense of pride and belonging in the Aboriginal community, but there are major barriers not only preventing progress for self-determination. For example, the Northern Territory intervention was a drastic and inhumane measure against the issues facing Aboriginal communities in Northern Australia that stripped many Indigenous people of their basic human rights and almost completely destroyed any concepts of self-determination that had been worked for beforehand. It is one of many obstacles that are preventing Aboriginal people and the wider community from achieving self-determination." Now, I shared that quote because I sat there with a heavy heart, but with an incredible sense of hope. That he's these two young, non-Indigenous students at a very good school, passionate enough to sit down and write a speech, having learned about the intervention. I believe all writers have a responsibility to hold a mirror up to society and reflect back to those who cannot see what is happening around them, and to make readers stop and think, which is why I participated in pulling together this anthology. I am a Wiradjuri woman, as you know. I'm from central New South Wales. I'm always conscious of whose country I'm on. I am the beneficiary of the sacrifices of the old people I went to Wave Hill to honour. We in the state of New South Wales enjoy the land rights that were born out of the protests made by the Gurindji people, led by Vincent Lingardi. And with that in mind, I keep asking myself how many of my extended family, how many of my friends, my fellow Australians, people in this room know the true story of the Wave Hill walk-off? And more importantly, how many understand that these very same people, these mob Apakal Gurindji, this very same community, have also been stripped of their self-determination, their sovereignty, their human rights because of the racist anti-intervention. It is why I'm using today's platform to raise awareness and awaken passion for insisting on reinstating the human rights of Indigenous Australians in the NT and, of course, in WA. Now, many older Australians who read my novel on the stolen generations will tell me, I didn't know. No Australian today can claim not to know what is happening in the Northern Territory. And the anthology that Rosie Scott and I put together, maybe you can see some of the names of the people up there also, it's just another means of helping Australians engage, think and talk about the issues that surround the policy, the practice and the repercussions for those impacted on. Australians who are also Indigenous. I was not surprised at all by the willingness and the urgency of the writers in this collection to speak out. They reflect a mere handful of those who generate conversations through their work daily on issues that matter to all of us as Australians. It doesn't matter if you're Koori, Murri, Noongar, Nanga, Wiradjuri, Waka Waka, Wadi Wadi, Bunjalung, Bunurong. An attack on Aboriginal people in the NT is an attack on Aboriginal people, the country